meeting on MINUSMA, which is the UN security operation in Mali. The following week, that is starting a week today, we'll be looking at our two signature events, that is COVID-19 in conflict and humanitarian situations and preventing conflict-related sexual violence. We'll also be having a meeting on Colombia, where we are delighted to be joined by President Duque, who will talk to Council members about the UN-backed peace process and upholding those hard-won gains ahead of the elections in Colombia later this summer. I think it's a very positive reminder for us of what can be achieved through the combination of national endeavour and international commitment. Next week also we will be talking about Yemen, where we've just issued statements today. We can come back to that. And then the week beginning the 18th of April, we'll be looking at Western Sahara, Kosovo, and then UNISFA, which is the South Sudan operation. And then the final week of our presidency, we will hold scheduled meetings on the Middle East peace process, Syria, the Great Lakes, and Libya, which will be as we approach the renewal of the UNSMIL mandate. We're also planning a private meeting on Myanmar, where we want to hear from both the UN and the ASEAN special envoys, and with a view to pressing the Tatmadaw to restore democratic civilian rule. That's a very quick overview. Obviously, a lot of it will be subject to change according to events, but those are our plans for the month of April, and I'm now very happy to take your questions. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll take questions starting with those in the room, but Valeria first. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador, for this press conference on behalf of ANCA, and we wish you the best of luck for this busy month ahead. My question is on Ukraine, and what are the next steps you are planning to take to put pressure on Russia, and if you agree to with the United States' intention to pursue Russia's suspension from the UN Human Rights Council. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Valeria, and thank you for your kind wishes. It's good to see you. As you say, we want to keep up the pressure on Russia. I think we succeeded in that in both times. We had General Assembly votes with 141 and then 140, first condemning the invasion and then calling for a humanitarian response. But as my Foreign Secretary has just said, we strongly support the US call to suspend Russia's voting rights in the Human Rights Council, and we will look to take that forward here in the coming days, because although, as people will know, the Human Rights Council meets in Geneva, the decision would be taken by the General Assembly here in New York. I also expect Russia to be isolated, continue to be isolated in the Security Council. We've seen a number of situations over the last 5.5 weeks where that's been the case, and we want to keep the pressure on Russia so that we can support all of the work that is going on to see Russia leave Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. I anticipate a lot of you will have questions on Ukraine, as with Valeria, so if we can ask those up front, that would be great, and just raise your hand. And I'll go to Nada first, I saw her.
Thanks, Ambassador. Just to follow up on the GA meeting. First, has there been a resolution circulated yet on that? And secondly, do you think we would have the votes in the General Assembly? The Russian ambassador to the UN in Geneva doesn't think there would be enough support. What do you say?
So there's not a draft resolution yet, but as I say, we'll seek to accelerate that in the coming days and probably hours, because we want to move fast on this one. In the General Assembly, I don't see why there wouldn't be. There's been widespread condemnation. First, as we said, 141 votes condemning the invasion, 140 votes calling for humanitarian support. And those seem to me very closely related to the sort of issues that the Human Rights Council discusses. And you saw the images coming out of Bucha. We've seen the suffering in Mariupol. It's hard to imagine that the wider General Assembly membership wouldn't support something as fundamental as that. But of course, we'll be working closely with partners across the regions, as we did last week for the previous resolution to make sure that people understand what is at stake in the vote here. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. I've been asked to remind you all to ask your questions into the mic when you have them. ED next, please. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. A couple of follow-ups. On tomorrow's meeting, first of all, we heard that the Russians demanded an emergency meeting on Brucha, and that the UK said no emergency meeting, we have one scheduled Tuesday. Could you explain why the UK decided not to respond to that request? And also, can you tell us what you expect as any kind of an outcome for tomorrow's meeting?
Thank you. And as the images from Brucha came through over the weekend, we were all appalled, and that was definitely part of our thinking in terms of shaping the agenda for the meeting that we had scheduled for tomorrow. The Russians were in touch with us in the course of yesterday, asking for a meeting and asking that it took place today. It's up to the presidency to schedule meetings, and in line with the rules, we have put together those two meetings. We already have the Secretary-General coming to brief, and I think we'll have a well-informed meeting, and with an extra less than 24 hours, we have scheduled that meeting, so met the Russians' request.
And the outcome, what are you expecting as an outcome? What's important about this meeting?
I think what's important about this meeting is it'll be the first opportunity the Security Council has had to discuss the images that we've seen in Brucha, which you've heard widely over the weekend described both as war crimes and as genocide. So we really are facing the true reality of the appalling Russian invasion of Ukraine. We'll need to think about how we deal with that. But I also expect it to continue the pressure on Russia to withdraw and end this illegal war.
Sharon, I think you were next.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. Sherwin Briceby, South African Broadcasting. Allow me to play devil's advocate here. How does the UK and its allies and partners plan to broaden the coalition against Russia within this building? I'm sure you're very well aware that there is whataboutism very much at play in the conversations you have. You saw the number of abstentions in both General Assembly resolutions. Whataboutism about the Iraq invasion in 2003, the NATO no-fly zone in Libya that has created vast insecurity in the Sahel region, civilians killed in Afghanistan. Just Google any wedding and something will pop up. So there's lingering resentment, Ambassador, particularly to Western nations now sort of imposing their will, but not really taking any, or acknowledging their past missteps, perhaps. Is there any room for that in your conversations moving forward?
I think there most certainly is. We have not only welcomed very much the widespread support we've had in the General Assembly, 2/3 of the General Assembly condemning the invasion and supporting a call for humanitarian aid, but we have heard the feedback and the comments from those who have abstained, sometimes not on the issue, but sometimes under pressure from one party or another. And I think it's important that we address that, particularly now as we see the ripple effects of this invasion by Russia spread out in increased food prices, increased commodity prices, increased energy prices, which will put more economic and social pressure, particularly, as the Secretary-General has said, on fragile and developing states. So they do have even more equity to join in calls to end the invasion and make sure that Russia is not part of the decision-making in the wider Security Council. We all depend on the UN Charter being observed for territorial integrity and sovereignty. We all depend on human rights being observed too. So I think there is a case to be made. I recognise that sometimes in the rush we perhaps haven't made that. We haven't had enough time to make it, and we'll certainly be working with and across our regional partnerships. I would say too, and I take the point, when we did the voting analysis, we saw quite widespread abstentions or even negative votes coming from sub-Saharan Africa. And I think it's understandable. You're talking about insecurity, you're talking about climate insecurity, talking about the rise of terrorism added on to many of these questions. But we're also talking in Russia, as many people, in southern Africa, as many people will know, of the widespread presence of Russian troops, either troops themselves or Wagner, the mercenary group that is known to be in Libya, now has moved into Mali. And I think that is also a factor that people need to weigh into the balance. They may, on the face of it, be talking about security, but actually I think it's a very disruptive force to have in the region, and we need to help explain some of that. Have I got to the nub of your question there, or did I miss something out? Oops.
I mean, you often hear the word hypocrisy, right, in terms of Western nations lecturing Russia on what it must and mustn't do, but there's no real penance or acknowledgement of past missteps in terms of the UN Charter being violated by a UK-US coalition in Iraq, for example, in 2003. Do you gain greater legitimacy by addressing those and saying, look, we've made mistakes in the past, and this is why we believe Russia is wrong too? Or do you just ignore the past and then sort of castigate Russia in what they're doing in Ukraine?
So we certainly don't ignore the past, but I think you've heard very clearly where the Secretary-General is, and the primary challenge now is to re-establish the primacy and the sanctity of the UN Charter and to end the invasion of Ukraine, the humanitarian suffering it's causing in Ukraine, but also now its ripple effects across the world. So we're all willing to learn lessons from the past, most certainly.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next question.
Yes, Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. Two questions. First of all, can you confirm that Russia has asked or is planning to schedule an ARIA meeting this month? And secondly, you mentioned the consideration of suspension of Russia from the Human Rights Council. I'm wondering why you would stop there. I mean, there's really more significance attached if there were consideration of suspending Russia from the voting in the General Assembly, or even broader than that, its membership in the UN and its ability to veto resolutions that are intended to address the humanitarian crisis and ceasefire and accountability in Ukraine. So could you comment on that, both in your capacity as President of the Security Council and in your national capacity? Thank you.
Thank you. So on the first question about the ARIA, yes, Russia is calling an ARIA meeting on Wednesday to talk about its allegations that there are, or to talk more generally about biolabs. So I think probably talking about chemical and biological weapons around the world. I would say that the Security Council has already had 3 meetings at Russia's request to discuss allegations, and at each meeting the UN Under-Secretary-General for Disarmament Affairs has been absolutely clear that there is not a shred of evidence for any of this, and that if there are allegations, then the proper procedure is to vacate the site and allow experts in, seal it and allow experts in to investigate, but not to make allegations like that. So yes, there will be an ARIA on Wednesday. On the second question, following on from the proposed suspension from the Human Rights Council, yes, there's been much discussion in the last 5.5 weeks as to whether Russia should be suspended from the Security Council. There's no provision for that. So I think the best we can do is to ensure that Russia abides by its responsibilities as a permanent member of the Security Council. And as we've seen, Russia has also been, I think, pretty roundly condemned in the General Assembly, just in terms of the number of votes that we've achieved. And then there's a sort of very technical point you raised about whether under 27.3 a country can be suspended from voting on an issue where it is a party to a conflict. There's a sort of very technical point around that, which is that's under a Chapter 6 resolution, not a binding Chapter 7 one. And so we haven't actually got to that point. But I think really the key point is to keep Russia isolated under pressure to withdraw from Ukraine and to use the levers we have here at the UN to try and contribute to that effort. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. Philippe, you had the next question. Philippe.
Sorry, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Ambassador. My question is on the Myanmar meeting, when it would be, and do you expect a product? Thank you.
Thanks, Philippe. The Myanmar meeting we've scheduled for the end of the month because we want to hear from both the ASEAN Special Envoy, Foreign Minister Prak of Cambodia, but also the UN Special Envoy Nolene Heitzer. Foreign Minister Prak has already been to Myanmar, as you know, but Special Envoy Heitzer's visit is scheduled for later in the month. So we're hoping that by moving the meeting towards the end of the month, we'll be able to hear from them both and then get back to talking about the 5 principles. We haven't got to a point of thinking about a product, although, as you know, it's now over a year since the coup and we did manage to get a product in our last presidency. But if there's a possibility, we'll try. But the main thing, I think, is to try and get the Tatmadaw back on track to restore stability and democracy. Thanks.
Good seeing you again, Ambassador. Evelyn Leopold, Globetrotter Media, Pass Blue, and who knows what else. My question, excuse me, my question is on suspending Russia's voting rights in the Human Rights Council. I can think of some other countries who certainly have violated human rights and are on the council, Syria, for example. And will there be enough support for Russia, considering the company it has on the Council of Human Rights Violators?
So there is an unfortunate pattern. I agree with you. The key, as I think you will know, of course, is that the decision is taken by the General Assembly. We saw Russia pretty isolated in the General Assembly. The only countries which supported them were Eritrea, Belarus, DPRK, and Syria. So I don't imagine that they'll get an awful lot more support in the General Assembly vote, but we do need to make sure we have the 2/3 in order to secure that suspension. And as I said, we'll be working with regional partners to discuss how that can work.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Celia? Yeah.
Sorry, I got this. Thank you. Thank you.
Bonjour, Ambassador. Some African countries are saying that the war in Ukraine is not their war. And however, they said they will pay a high price. What do you think about it?
I think I can understand the first thought that it's not their war. We've seen tragic amounts of conflict on the African continent. It takes up about 70% of our time on the Security Council. So I can see that at one level it may well not seem like their war. And yet, as you said in the second part of your comment, it's going to make things, I think, even worse in Africa. A lot of well, 2 things. First of all, of course, we all know that the southwest of Russia and Ukraine is the breadbasket, and a lot of the wheat exported from there goes to Africa, Latin America, Middle East markets, Asian markets. But more importantly, too, the World Food Programme gets 50% of its wheat from Ukraine alone. And that, of course, will feed into many of the humanitarian programmes that David Beasley runs through the World Food Programme. So there is a tragedy. It's not Africa's war. They've got, excuse me, more than enough problems of their own with growing terrorism, climate security, fighting within the countries, humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia, conflict in Sudan, and you know the list. And yet, this war, this Russian invasion of Ukraine, is going to make things worse for Africa as well. So that's why it is so important that we keep the pressure on Russia to get out of Ukraine.
Thank you, Ambassador. Kristen, you had the next question.
It looks like the Russian ambassador is going to have a press conference this afternoon, given that he wasn't granted his meeting this afternoon. Do you worry that as the 2 sides get into this debate, do you worry that by not engaging him in the council on this today, in these continuing back and forth press conferences, that the sides just get pushed further apart. How do you combat misinformation when you have two separate sides that are basically holding separate events and not talking to each other? And does it not fuel their claims of disinformation if some of those questions aren't addressed? Thanks.
So I think there's some quite complicated and interesting questions in there. Thank you for those. I think the first thing to say is to reassure everyone that we have met the Russian request to host a meeting, to hold a meeting. It will take place at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. As presidency, that's what we do. People ask us if they can have meetings and we schedule them. So it is true that we couldn't schedule it, and we didn't schedule it according to the Russian request. That's partly, as I mentioned, because we have the Secretary General coming. We have other senior UN briefers, including Martin Griffiths, who is on his way to Kyiv. So I think we'll have a more informed meeting by having it tomorrow, which will be, I think, the most important counter to Russian disinformation. But as you've alluded to, this war has been fought not just tragically on the ground of Ukraine, not just in its ripple effects, but it has been a war, frankly, not just of disinformation, but of lies. And I think it was the Latvian Prime Minister who said yesterday, there's lies, damned lies, and Russian disinformation. And it's very damaging, and that's why I very much appreciate all of you being here, being interested in what we have to say, because we are doing our very best to provide reliable information, verifiable information, and then to use that to push back the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, next question.
Thank you, Ambassador. Betül Yörük, Turkish news agency Anadolu. President Biden today called for a war crime trial, and also the UN Secretary General called for an investigation in Ukraine after civilians being killed in Bucha. And I was wondering if you think Russia has committed crimes, and if there is enough evidence, although we know that Russia is a veto power, would the UK seek at the Security Council a resolution to refer Russia to the International Criminal Court? Thanks.
Thank you. So the International Criminal Court, under Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan, is already collecting evidence of or conducting an investigation into war crimes. And the UK was one of the first countries of the over 40 now who've supported that call to join that support for the International Criminal Court investigation. So that work is very important, and it doesn't require a Security Council resolution when it's had requests from so many member states. And I think it's very important that Karim Khan and his team are allowed to gather evidence and do so in a way that gives us enough evidence. So you have to do that very thoroughly and very carefully. There are a number of other ways of holding Russia accountable to this. So in addition to the International Criminal Court, there's, of course, the International Court of Justice. There have been calls for other mechanisms, such as an accountability tribunal or something like that. But at the moment, I think we're best working with the mechanisms that we have. They're already established. So we are very pleased to be supporting the work that Karim Khan is doing. But to be honest, appalled by the ready availability of the evidence, particularly what we've seen in Bucha over the weekend.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, you have the next question. Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador. Stefano Vaccara, La Voce di New York. My question is on Libya, but then if you allow me, I have a follow-up on my interesting question that my colleague Sherwin did before. On Libya, you have 2 meetings, I believe, here. And what are the chances that the mission is going to be renewed for longer than 3 months? And also there is the problem of the special advisor of the Secretary General. So are we having progress here, or things are getting worse? And there is also a question on your national capacity. European countries in Libya have been, for the last few years, have been doing not been doing a common policy, let's call it like this. Is maybe now the new unity that came from the crisis in Ukraine is going to help the Europeans. So I include UK, but also France and Italy and Germany in finding a common policy there. And then if you allow me after that, a follow up on the question before.
So thank you for your question on Libya. Yes, so at the moment, Stephanie Williams, who is the Secretary General's Special Advisor, is doing an excellent job. But as you say, in difficult circumstances, she's been doing a very strong job in bringing together the various parties to try to hold the constitution together and move forwards towards having elections. But there have been recent challenges. We do need to renew the mandate, and we need to do that in a way that makes sense on the ground. So we'll spend some time now in discussions looking at the best way of renewing that mandate. The appointment of Stephanie's successor, a new special envoy, will be, of course, for the Secretary General, but as he's been clear, a new special envoy should be based in Tripoli and therefore able to talk to parties and continue, I think, to try to meet the will of the 2.8 million Libyan voters who want to see their country back on the road to democracy and back in stability and peace. Thank you. And you had a second question too.
Yes, it's just a follow-up on the question about hypocrisy, because I think that question was a very important, because if we go into the, especially the General Assembly, right? I remember in the first vote, that passed large majority, I remember the speech by the Serbian ambassador. They say, I'm going to vote your resolution, he said. But I don't like when you say this is, it was referring not only to the Ukrainian ambassador, it was referring who was presenting a resolution, that this is the first time after the Second World War that then a capital has been bombed without the authorization of the United Nations, because Belgrade was bombed without the authorization of the United Nations. So are you trying, maybe your national capacity, I mean, we could expect also from a US ambassador, but wouldn't help you to find more consensus in say, yes, we were wrong in not respecting the Charter, and these are the consequences, we have to fix this institution?
I think this goes back to the question of history, and I agree with you. I found one of the, how shall I put this, one of the most valuable things that I do here when we talk, for example, about resolutions on Africa or discussions on Africa, which takes up, as I say, about 70% of our time, is listening closely to my African colleagues and really doing what we say when we say African solutions to African challenges. So I agree with you. I think there's always a place for looking at history, learning from mistakes, and then trying to use those to inform what we do in the future, and particularly with many countries who have long memories here of things that may have gone wrong in the past, for which the UK may have been responsible or other countries may have been responsible. So we do have to respect people's history and point of view, and then try and bring them to understand how that aligns with the UN Charter, which is what we're all here, all signed up to, and all trying to make sure that it works.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we have just a couple more questions from those in the room, and then we'll move to the people on the screen. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador Mario Villar with the Spanish news agency EFE. As you said, Martin Griffiths is planning to go to Kiev. He was in Moscow today. Do you see any chance of this initiative for a humanitarian ceasefire working out, given what you've heard from the Russians? And do you expect the Council to do anything to try to support Mr. Griffiths?
Yes, so I was talking to the Secretary General just last week about the importance of the initiative for humanitarian ceasefires and the importance he attaches to the mission that Martin has gone on. And he's had a pretty busy time because he was, of course, in Kabul and then Doha for the Afghanistan conference. So now in Moscow trying to negotiate the humanitarian ceasefires and then going on to Kyiv. So he certainly has our full support as presidency and as the UK. And I'm sure he has the full support of, if not all members of the Council, then all but maybe one or two. So we very much hope that this will be successful, because as we've seen from Bucha, but also from Mariupol and so many other cities and some of the provincial cities around Kyiv, the urgency of humanitarian assistance for Ukraine is very high indeed. You've seen the numbers of people who've fled the country. So we are definitely working closely with Martin and his team to try and make this work.
Thank you, Ambassador. Alan, you have a question?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. First of all, I wish you best of luck during your presidency. I have a follow-up once again regarding the Russia's request on emergency meeting on Bucha. I got it that you're scheduled for tomorrow, but could you please explain me the logic, as this is a high-profile question, high-profile matter, and the Russian side claims that at the tomorrow's meeting, given the number of the briefers, the attention might be a little bit distracted from the particular Bucha matter. So why have you decided to move it to tomorrow but not to hold the meeting today? Thank you.
So I have absolutely no doubt that the situation in Bucha will be absolutely front and centre of the meeting tomorrow. As I said, the meeting tomorrow will allow us to hear from the Secretary-General, from Martin Griffiths, who will be on his way to Kyiv at that point, and from UN representatives on the ground. So we'll have an objective account. I agree, the images that we saw coming out of Bucha over the weekend were harrowing, appalling, probable evidence of war crimes and possibly of genocide. So we have moved fast, but we didn't see a good reason to have two meetings back-to-back on Ukraine. So that's why we have acceded to the Russian request, as we do as presidency, and we will hold their request for a meeting tomorrow, by which time I hope we'll have more information and we can have a more informed discussion as well.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think Alan had the last question from the room, so I'll go to Abdelhamid on the screen, but if anyone else has a question, please just wave.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. This is Abdelhamid Fayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. I'm asking you in your capacity as the representative of UK, when the Palestinians resist their occupiers, they are called terrorists. When Israel bombed Gaza, destroyed buildings, including media buildings and families, they are called self-defense. We don't see the same argument when the Ukrainians fight their occupiers, they are heroes. And when Russia bombed a building, then it's a war crime. Don't you see that there is double standard here and that perpetuated the suffering of the Palestinian people because many Western countries continue to deal with Israel different than the rest of the those countries who occupy others or who commit war crimes? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So can I just check, was your question more about the Middle East side of things or about Ukraine? It wasn't quite clear. I'm afraid the sound quality isn't great.
I'm asking about the double standard of how you deal with the Palestinians when they resist their occupiers. They've been occupied for over 54 years now. And when you talk the same thing, when the Ukrainians resist their occupiers, they are heroes, while the Palestinians are terrorists. Isn't that double standard of treating the Palestinian this way perpetuated the occupation that long?
Thank you. Well, I think I would say that, first of all, we deeply regret the loss of life, and in particular, recently we saw the tragedy of 2 Ukrainians killed, 2 Jewish Israelis, and an Arab-Israeli policeman. So all of that is another example of the appalling cost of the ongoing conflict. But the UK has, I think, for the duration, been clear in that we support a negotiated settlement leading to a safe and secure Israel living alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state, of course, based on the 1967 borders. So we do try to be both objective and even-handed, despite the various complexities of the conflict, which, of course, you're well aware of.
Thank you, Ambassador. And next question is from James on the screen as well, please.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thank you, Ambassador, for all your answers so far, particularly about efforts to censor Russia within the UN system. You've spoken about the Human Rights Council, and you've spoken about there being no provision for removing voting rights of Russia in the Security Council. I'm just wondering, is this additional dimension to this question, which is the claim made by Ukraine and some others that the seat that Russia holds in the Security Council actually doesn't belong to Russia, it actually belongs to the Soviet Union, which was, of course, dissolved. Have you made an assessment of that, and does that argument hold any water from the British perspective?
I think it's a complex argument. I've heard it from the Ukrainians now several times. I think just in practical terms, there probably is very little value in going down that route. And I say that because we are dealing with, as we've already been discussing, an already packed Security Council agenda, a Russian invasion of Ukraine that has, frankly, trampled on the UN Charter, as you've heard the Secretary General say very clearly, that has probably involved war crimes and possibly genocide. So I think it's important that the Security Council and its members try and prioritise these key issues rather than looking at what may be a valid line of inquiry, but I think would seem to most people quite a long way from resolving our immediate responsibility for the humanitarian, the human rights, and primarily the peace and security aspects of this conflict.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think that was our last question, unless anyone's going to... Oh, yes, thank you.
Hello, thank you, Ambassador. My name is Marisela Rivera with the Yomiuri Shimbun. I have a question on the DPRK. Can we expect any meetings on that? Anything to strengthen the sanctions regimes on DPRK? Thank you.
So I think I would say, regrettably, I fear that's quite possible. We, of course, saw the recent ICBM test from North Korea, and the signs are that they have more in preparation. We've seen the reports that they may be excavating the tunnels under Pongri where they've previously conducted their nuclear tests. All of that is very concerning to us, and I had a meeting last week with Ambassador Liu Xiaoming, who is the Chinese Special Envoy for DPRK, to discuss these things. And of course the Security Council had a meeting too following the ICBM test, which landed, as you'll know, in the Japanese EEZ. We're well aware that this month holds a couple of key dates for the North Koreans. One of them is Kim Il-sung's birthday in mid-month. The other is, I think, Army Day or Military Day at the end of the month, and that traditionally the North Koreans have used those days in order to test further missiles. Of course, we hope they won't, but I'm afraid in the current climate I fear that they will. And our view is that that and the recent tests, we've had 13 missiles tested in 10 batches already this year, suggests that the Council may well end up having to meet on this again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think that was our final question. So without further ado, thank you everyone for coming, and I'm sure we'll be in touch throughout the rest of April. Thanks.